Hello everyone, how's it going? So in this video I wanted to show you how to make this exact scene. We will be mainly focusing on the environment, on the fog, on the lighting, and we will also be taking a look at how to make interactive waves using dynamic paint. So as always, I will link all the necessary assets in the description, and if you are a beginner, feel free to slow the video down, and hopefully by the end you should have a really nice result. I'm starting with a plane which is supposed to be our lake mesh, giving it a dimension of 64 by 64 meters. Adding our camera early on, giving it a vertical aspect ratio and a focal length of 22 millimeters. Position it in a height that makes sense, in this case 1 meters. Add some geometry to our lake mesh, and now we need to add our landscape using the ANT landscape add-on. I usually use Gaia, but for this one it's really overkill. Use this add-on, it works really well. Play around with the presets, play around with the seed, and be mindful of the composition. We want some trees to be closer to the camera, and we want some trees to be further away. On the sides I want trees to be closer to the camera, which is, as you can see, I'm adding. Play around with the rotation until I get a composition that I like. Add a different mountain mesh from the ANT landscape to be our backdrop. Position it where it makes sense. You could stretch it, it doesn't have to be pretty. Extrude the borders of it to wrap around our camera, since we will be scattering trees on those, and it would help us a lot to add some reflections on the lake. Make sure to be using cycle, and add a stormy HDRI. Make sure that it's overcast, it doesn't have any sharp shadows, since we will be adding our area planes, which will do the rest for us. Play around with its rotation until you get something that you like, and add some more resolution to the geometry near the camera, since, as I mentioned earlier, we will be doing some dynamic waves, and these need a lot of geometry. Add a sphere, which is supposed to act like a rock falling down. Give it a animation of going down, like a rock would go. And as you can see here, I am animating it. Go to our lake mesh and give it a modifier, which is dynamic paint. In the modifier, add the canvas and make sure that it's set to wave. Do the same thing for our sphere and make sure that it's set to brush. At this point, it's really just playing around with the resolution. Make sure to have resolution. It's very, very important. It's the same as displacement. If you don't have resolution, you won't have deformation. I like to play around with the time scale. I like to play around with the speed, maybe with the damping or spring, maybe the smoothness. And just all around, just play around with the speed of the rock. Play around with the amount of geometry. Make sure that nothing is flipped. Make sure that your normals are set correctly. And once you like the result, make sure to apply the modifier, which we added, the dynamic paint modifier. Scale it on the Z-axis if you want it to be more intense. And I didn't really care as much about the quality of this, because I will be either way adding some clouds displacement texture on top to emulate some smaller waves and some big waves. I will be adding a big layer of displacement and a medium scale layer of displacement as well. For the finer details, I will be doing it in the shader editor, as you will see in a moment. Give your lake mesh some actual volume. At first I wanted to go with the volumetric setup for this mesh. However, later on the position of the camera made it only reflect, not refract, which is why I didn't even go through the hassle. Add some noise, stretch it to emulate wind, and plug it into a bump node. Make sure that it's very, very slight. We still want to see some reflections. At this point, I think it's best to add our textures to our mesh. I will link the texture that I have used. I used the aerial rocks from Polyhaven. As always, links down below. Add it there, append the material, and it's already set up perfectly. In this case, I remove the displacement and make sure that the UVs make sense. They don't have to be extra detailed since we will be covering it with vegetations later on, and the fog will be hiding most of the details either way, so no point in giving this more details. And use Geoscatter add-on, which is practically the best add-on I have ever used for Blender. Also, by using the forestation pack, I layered 3 types and made sure that none of them is growing out of the lake material by using the elevation in the abiotic option in Geoscatter. Play around with the density, play around with the rotation, make sure that it's set to global Z, and give it some slight tilt. Very slight, we don't want it to be falling down per se. As you can see, I added 3 types in front of you. And it's just the more you layer, the better it will look. However, just make sure that they make sense to be together. Right, we don't want to have any palm trees near some Nordic trees. Right, wouldn't make sense with it. Add the trees to our backdrop. Give it some good scale, which makes sense. And all around, just be mindful of the composition again. The composition is key for these sorts of images in order to have a good contrast once we add the fog. Now the most important part, add your cube mesh, which will be our volumetric fog mesh. Give it a principled volume shader, give it some slight density, give it some anisotropy, and some very, very slight emission strength, excuse me. I like to sample colors from my own HDRI to use in our shader since it makes more sense, and always usual I like to desaturate it a slight bit. Add an area light. So for this area light I wanted to highlight the trees and give us a nice sort of rim light and a nice gradient to emulate, like, what can I say, for example, the moon. As you can see, give it some warmer colors using a black body node. Just position it where it makes sense, position it where it really highlights the trees, the really nice trees that we have here. Now it's time to add our distant fog, which is why I will duplicate our same mesh, make it bigger, and play around with its shape slightly. As you can see, I will give it some tilt down below, since we want this to be a gradient type of volume, so it's less dense downwards and very dense upwards. As you can see now, I will add a gradient map, rotate it on the Y axis, and offset it using the X slider location. Add a noise map, which we'll do here, and try to give it a scale which makes sense to give more irregularities to our fog. Mix those using a linear light in the color mix node, and play around with the sliders and the factor. Also plug this into the density. Make sure that it's the density and the emission. If you want different colors, that's a different story, but for this one, make sure to plug it into the density. I made a mistake here, which I will rectify in a second, as you can see. Make sure to add a color wrap in between to have final control over the mesh. And I also like to add a math node set to multiply to have a lot finer control over this. Multiply the values by whatever number you want. Duplicate your light so we get to have a nice gradient, as I mentioned earlier. Plug it into the emission strength, and as always, play around with the values using a multiply math node. Now, it's very important to visualize it using the full scene, the trees. You could even do a couple of test renders, which is practically very necessary. Play around with the strength, play around with the density of the fog, play around with the emission, play around with the HDRI. Nothing really looks perfect from the first get-go. And the more time you spend, the better it will look. As you could see, I'm just playing around with the density until I get something that I really like. At this point, I want to add some fuzzy grass. For this grass, I know that it won't have to be very detailed since it it will be pretty hidden between the trees and the fog. So here I added a pack from the grass blade add-on, integrated in the geoscatter, and only left one type, which is the big oat grass. Play around with the strength, play around with its elevation. I don't want any grass down below. And make sure to have camera optimization on if you don't intend this to be an animation. Later on I will be showing you a really nice animation project. But for now we don't need so much geometry, which is why I have the camera optimization on. Here you see I removed all of the displacement and gave more density and scale to our oat grass. You know, you want a fuzzy type of look in the grass. It doesn't have to be perfectly detailed, however, it just has to be there. At this point, I am adding some dead leaves from the Botanic add-on. You could do the exact same thing from Sketchfab. You could make your own. You could do a lot of similar things for free, right? For this one, I just find this to be more convenient. As you can see, I am painting a vertex group to specify where I want our dead leaves to be and lily pads later on. Botanic add-on comes with a particle system, which is practically set up for you, so you just get it in, adapt it to your mesh, and it looks good from the get-go. Usually I wouldn't go for this approach, however, for these tutorials, as I mentioned earlier, I'm really going with a type of very slow-paced type of learning curve for this channel. I am treating this channel as a relatively singular source of information, so almost all of the scenes have some type of tie between them in terms of skills. As you can see, I'm also adding a cube, and deleting its front face to block off the light, giving it a darker color to block even more light. Play around with it. You know, I don't want any lights to be near the camera, in front of the camera or near it. And as you can see, it's just making the foreground look dark, which is giving us some really nice contrast later on. So I will be adding some Sketchfab assets, as always, link in the description. A duck and a boat. Position it where it makes sense. Always be mindful of the composition. That as well I will talk fanatically about. So I will be talking a lot about composition for this one. I'm just using the very simple and classic rule of thirds. Add your boat in place, and once you add your boat in place, add a human figure from Blender Kit. It's free. It has some relatively nice models, maybe not the most detailed, but it really works for our purpose. Position the guy in Andrew. Position Andrew in the good position. The asset is called Andrew. And amputate his legs. Rotate it until it makes sense. Set it up. As always, think about composition, rule of thirds, and have a look at how it's looking. Make sure to do test renders every now and then. I know how the scene's looking, which is why I'm not doing any test renders. The viewport in Blender works wonders, right? It's really fast, it's really enjoyable. Play around with the exposure, play around with the values, play around with the gamma. And at this point, I want to add some depth of field, so I don't have very crystal sharp lily pads in front of me. I also want to add some volumetric fog to the ground, so some low-hanging volumetrics. Simply by adding a cube, squashing it down, giving it some more uniform geometry, to add a displacement on top of it, some displacement using clouds, make the displacement really powerful. I mean, shouldn't really matter if it's intersecting with the camera, it's fine. Be okay to play around with the settings of the principled BSDF. As I mentioned earlier, it's just playing around, seeing what works and what doesn't work. As you can see, so the techniques I'm showing you are really repetitive for these ones. As I mentioned earlier, I consider this channel as a singular source of videos, so everything is relatively tight. I'm going with simpler techniques, and later on I will be talking about some pretty advanced techniques. Give it some bluish tint, give it some greenish tint as well, as you can see here. And all around, just take this to Photoshop or Affinity Photo. I like to use Affinity Photo, and give it some more punch. Almost every render needs some post-processing. So hopefully the scene is almost done. You know, you could always spend more time on it. However, for this one, I didn't really want to spend too much time. It took me 55 minutes exactly to make. Not even, I would say 50 minutes. So give some light paths. Give 2 light paths in the volumetric setup. And hopefully you should have a really nice render going on. In the next video, I will be talking about some slightly more advanced techniques, still very, very simple, but slightly more advanced than this one. We will be making a really nice beach scene, which is semi-procedural, which is my go-to when I'm making any beach scene, or any scene that needs sand or sea by any measures. So hopefully you like the video, and hopefully you find it useful. If you did, feel free to subscribe to the channel. And if you have any questions or any suggestions, or you want any video to be done, feel free to drop it down in the comments, or even message me over on Instagram or Facebook. Take care until next time we meet again.